Hello and welcome to Spotlight. The United States and its allies seem to have no intention to ease tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Washington is set to host tabletop exercises with South Korea next week aimed at improving operations of American nuclear assets and their joint springtime drills next month. North Korea says it has not conducted any special military action this year. So if the U.S. and South Korea go ahead with their war games, it will create a grave vortex of escalating tension. In that case, Pyongyang has warned that they will face unprecedentedly persistent and strong counteractions. To discuss the issue further in our program tonight, we've invited researcher and political analyst Christopher Helali, joining us from Vershire, Vermont. And also we have journalist, activist, and political analyst John Bosnich joining us from Belgrade. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Helali. North Korea, as we just read, has threatened to take unprecedentedly strong responses if South Korea and the U.S. press ahead with their planned military drills, accusing the two of raising tensions in the region. How could these drills affect the already tense situation on the Korean Peninsula?
Thank you so much for having me. I think that these drills are very dangerous and further escalation and provocations against the DPRK. We've seen over the past decades that the U.S. and South Korea have further strengthened their military capabilities, their integration militarily, as well as in intelligence and in other aspects. And so we see not only military drills, but also the creation of a hybrid warfare situation where the DPRK is attacked not only with economic sanctions, but also with cyber attacks, increased espionage, and now with these massive military drills that will include strategic like B-1B bombers that are nuclear capable, stealth bombers, and other aircraft and military equipment. So of course it's seen as a great provocation. Remember that the Korean War is still in an armistice situation. There's no peace treaty. So technically the DPRK and the US and its allies are still at war. And so this escalation and provocation only brings instability and further destabilizes the region as a whole. And that's actually what the US and South Korea want in this situation.
John Bosnich, it's not the first time that North Korea has said the U.S. military drills with South Korea are pushing tensions to an extreme red line. And it's also said that it's prepared to counter the moves with the quote-unquote most overwhelming nuclear force. Following a visit to Seoul by U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin last month, Pyongyang again warned that expanding these exercises threatens to turn the region into a huge war arsenal. Give us your perspective on these warnings.
Well, this type of confrontation has been brewing for some time. The United States keeps upping the ante, and it's not only putting pressure on South Korea to prepare for an act of war, but it also is leaning on Japan, which is something that very few people ever discuss when they talk about a potential war on the Korean Peninsula. I was in Japan in the 1980s and 1990s, where I worked as a journalist. And during my time there, I visited the U.S. and Japanese military base in Sendai in northern Japan. And while monitoring the control consoles, I saw the nuclear option switch, which Japan denied ever existed. And I published that in newspapers in the West and in the East. These people are talking business, and they're talking about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are not a defensive tactic.
Christopher Helali, Washington has rejected Pyongyang's statements thus far, expressing a willingness to meet with its diplomats at a time and place convenient for them, and said the U.S. has made clear that, quote, we have no hostile intent towards North Korea. All the provocations, though, suggest otherwise, don't they?
They absolutely do. And I think it's very important to understand here that the United States, for its part, is only increasing the provocations and aggression. And as Mr. Bosnich said correctly, Japan is a piece and an intimate part in this entire dangerous dance that the U.S., South Korea, and the West are doing overall. And so I think that there is no real effort because the U.S. has never really been serious. I think the only serious gesture, some might say, was under the Trump administration to meet with the leader Kim Jong-un and to try to broker some sort of agreement and framework. And of course, Donald Trump was the first president to step foot in the DPRK. But overall, the U.S. side has not been willing or able because, of course, the control in Washington is amongst the neocons and these hawks who are very aggressive towards the DPRK. And of course, I think many of them feel that it's the one that got away, whereas they were able to get, sort of the weapons of mass destruction, quote unquote, out of the hands of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and Saddam Hussein in Iraq. They were not able to do it with the DPRK and with Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il. So I think ultimately what they see is that this is the one that got away, and we have, something to fight about regarding this. And so I think that the dangerous escalation here is part of an ongoing a plan of provocations. And there's no serious attempt here because ultimately the U.S. is looking for regime change in the DPRK. That's its stated goal. That's what it wants. And it's not interested in peace nor reunification on the Korean Peninsula.
John Bosnich, about the U.S., would you say that Washington's North Korea policy is rather unclear and foggy at the moment? It says it wants talks and that the drills aren't aimed at provoking Pyongyang, but the military exercises are clearly a source for tension. What is Washington pursuing right now, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, there's no doubt whatsoever about what America wants to do to North Korea, and that is they want to destroy the North Korean state, and they don't want just regime change, they want puppet regime installation. That's the only reason that they fool with the regimes of other countries, is to install their pre-selected, pre-trained agents. They don't leave anything to chance. If their first candidate isn't put in power, then their second will be. And North Korea is absolutely correct to maintain the maximum defenses. North Korea is facing a heavily armed South Korean military. It is facing the world's, at one point they called themselves the sole superpower, but definitely the most highly armed nuclear power in the world. And they see North Korea as an impediment to their effort to encircle and put a full-on embargo around both Russia and China. And this is their target. They've made it clear. And Japan is definitely a silent partner and a major participant in any such plans.
Mr. Hilali, nuclear tensions on the peninsula look to be accelerating dramatically. Just recently, South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol expressed his country's interest in developing nuclear weapons or asking the U.S. to consider redeploying them in the region. Such a statement could complicate the regional security environment and also spark an arms race on the peninsula, couldn't it?
Absolutely, and I would caution to say, and I believe this strongly myself personally, that the United States already has nuclear weapons on or near the peninsula because many of its submarines, its important aircraft that are nuclear capable, and its land forces can have nuclear weapons without necessarily South Korea knowing, or very few people knowing. So I think that they're already in the region. It's part of the nuclear triad and sort of what the U.S. Has in terms of a nuclear posture and strategy. So I think nuclear weapons are already present. I think the DPRK understands this and recognizes this. That's why they continue to be the only ones who are sane in this situation, speaking about de-escalation and about going back to the negotiating table, but really being honest about negotiations and not simply speaking about it but not doing it. And the U.S. isn't interested in that. Neither are the South Koreans, or for that matter, the Japanese, who could help to push. The Chinese have helped to push the DPRK and the U.S. to the table at multiple points, but it doesn't seem to be working because the U.S. isn't interested in that. And of course, South Korea is a puppet regime. As Mr. Bosnich notes, the U.S. is interested in not only regime change, but having their puppets installed. And of course, the South Korean regime is a puppet regime, so it follows what the U.S. Says and wants. And so ultimately here you have to recognize that this escalation, this nuclear tension, is already alive and well on the peninsula. It factors in multiple powers because a nuclear exchange on the peninsula will include Russia and China. So already we're looking down the barrel of a third world war on the Korean peninsula, and the U.S. doesn't seem to want to back down from the brink. And this sort of Damocles, as many eloquent politicians used to speak about, over our heads, and the situation of nuclear annihilation isn't really a concern for the U.S. or for its allies. And that's the grave danger here. The grave danger is at how far are they going to push this to the edge? Because it can always be as simple as a mistake or a miscalculation to lead us to a nuclear exchange.
Sure. I'm going to stay with you, Mr. Helali, about Washington's negotiations with North Korea. How come that just faded away? And is there still, in your opinion, a chance or the will now to get North Korea back to the negotiating table, specifically when Pyongyang stated its initial demands would not change for any future talks?
I don't think there's any interest in the U.S. for talks or negotiations with the DPRK at all. I think that Trump, had a personal feeling and relationship with Kim Jong-un and liked him as a person and wanted to see some peace, wanted to get some deal. But nobody in the establishment in D.C. Or in the sort of military political establishment of the West is interested necessarily in negotiations or a peaceful settlement, because from Washington emanates the source of the conflict, which is increasing military aggression, increasing political and economic aggression, and of course, sanctions are siege warfare. So the U.S. continues to sanction the Korean people and inflict tremendous suffering, and the DPRK has shown its resilience over the past 70 plus years in countering those sanctions, just like other countries like Iran are doing today. So ultimately, there's no real effort and no real push for a peaceful settlement on the Korean Peninsula. And that's ultimately the responsibility of the United States, and they're not interested in it.
John Bosnich, same question to you about the issue of negotiations. Was Washington, in your opinion, ever on the cusp of giving any concessions at all? I also think one of the major questions was, could the U.S. be trusted at all with the deal?
Well, having covered the wars here in the Balkans, I can tell you that almost every deal that the United States signed, they violated in one way or another. So I wouldn't trust the paper that they printed a deal on in the first place. Secondly, when it comes to the U.S. political military strategy for Northeast Asia, their entire objective is total dominance. It is not coexistence. They could have eased the sanctions on North Korea. They could have lifted the sanctions on North Korea. But the purpose of the sanctions is to destabilize the government of North Korea. It is not to help the people of North Korea. It is not to do anything in order to develop a better pressure situation for making a new deal. And when it comes to negotiations, the United States doesn't negotiate. The United States sends ultimatums, just as they recently sent an ultimatum down here in the Balkans to Serbia. The United States does not negotiate. They dictate the terms that they want. If you don't sign on the dotted line, they start to put the corkscrew to you and try to rip your country apart. That's the way they operate. And anybody who denies that, I'd like to see him say that publicly and debate it and defend it, because there's no possible defense for the methods that they use. Not in a civilized world, and not in a world that has the United Nations to settle international disputes without warfare.
Christopher Helali, how has the lack of movement in the U.S.-North Korea talks affected South Korea and the notion, overall the notion of peace on the Korean Peninsula? In other words, will the U.S. allow a progression of peace to happen without Washington being a part of the equation?
Definitely not. Remember that the South is one of the most major base structures for the United States. The U.S. has countless bases on the Korean Peninsula in the south, and so it's part of its security architecture, not only for the DPRK, but to have a position in East Asia to be able to counter the DPRK and Russia and China simultaneously. So, of course, they've invested tremendous amounts of money. We're talking beyond billions, even into the trillions of dollars in terms of its decades-long infrastructure development. It has tens of thousands of troops on the ground, capabilities in air defense, in missiles, in strategic bombers, in naval assets that are there. So I don't think that the South Koreans can go and make a peace agreement on their own without the Americans backing, because ultimately it is a puppet regime. And I think if you look at it in that way, and Mr. Bosnich has been eloquent about this, you recognize that no deal can be done because the United States is the power player behind it, and the United States doesn't want a deal. So the previous government in South Korea tried to go even further with the North, and there was, especially under the Trump administration, big overtures for getting the North and the South together and to try to come to some kind of consensus and agreement. And there was progress. But don't forget that this issue is a political ping pong in South Korea, and that many presidents have and political leaders have lost their credibility and have lost elections because of trying to appeal to reunification and peace with the DPRK, with the North. So ultimately, I don't see the political will either in Seoul or nor in Washington for a political settlement or a solution at this point. It's just not going to happen.
John Bosnich, will there be any progression of peace on the Korean Peninsula as far as Washington is concerned?
Absolutely not. During the term of Joseph Biden and his successor, if he steps down before his term ends because of his evident senility, nothing will be made, no steps will be made towards a solution on the Korean Peninsula. There is a possibility if Trump were to return as president that he might reinitiate his personal negotiations, which may produce some results. But remember this, no decisions about war and peace are made in the White House. They are made at the corporate boards of directors of the military-industrial complex that pays the cost of the election campaigns of the warmongers that they put in office. If they don't sign off on peace, the U.S. president does not have a pen with which to sign any document.
Sure. Christopher Lalliot, talking about the issue of peace on the Korean Peninsula, we spoke about South Korea being amongst basically the major stakeholder in this process, but there has to be more than meets the eye. And by that, I mean the intricate bilateral and multilateral relationships inside and outside the peninsula with other players being, apart from the North and the South, it's Japan, it's the United States, it's China. Can you elaborate on that for us as well?
Sure, of course. I mean, any agreement on the peninsula and the overall geopolitics of the peninsula have to incorporate Russia, China, Japan, and of course the United States, which is basically, the second ruler of South Korea, really the de facto, maybe not the de jure, but the de facto ruler of South Korea. So it has to include all of these powers, which means that the only way to have a peaceful resolution is to go back to the United Nations, which is able to arbitrate and to bring about a just resolution of this conflict. If they are not allowed to do that, and the U.S. has no real push to do that, the Chinese have said they want to go and bring this back to the UN. The Russians have said back to the negotiating table, but the U.S. doesn't want that. And so at this point, we have all of these players, all of these partners, 3 of which are nuclear powers, 2 of which have nuclear capabilities through the United States. And, actually 4 of them, because you have Russia, China, the U.S., and the DPRK, which has nuclear capabilities. So, of course, if you're having this situation, you have to go to a body that is able to arbitrate in a neutral setting with international law and, principles, international norms and values. But the U.S. isn't interested in that because the U.S. is a rogue nation. Ultimately, the U.S. does what it wants. It still has this sort of unipolar mindset. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it still sees itself as the hegemon. And so it doesn't want that, whereas Russia and China and the DPRK are willing to go back, are willing to go to the negotiating table in good faith. The U.S. has not been willing to do that. So if there is to be peace, and it is to include all of these partners, it has to be done in a situation where the U.S. has to give up something. But the U.S. has shown itself unwilling to give up anything. In fact, it simply wants to take more. And that's the danger here, is that if you meet an object that is, immovable in this situation, you really find yourself in a very, very tough position. And the DPRK finds itself today in a very tough position with further aggression and escalations from the U.S. And it's put into a corner. And what does an animal that is, put into a corner do? It might lash out. So that's the danger here, is that the U.S. is pushing it.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. That's all the time we have for tonight's show. Researcher and political analyst Christopher Hilali joining us from Versailles, Vermont. Journalist, activist, and political analyst John Bosnich joining us from Belgrade. Thank you for contributing to this program, and also special thanks to you, our viewers, for staying with us on tonight's Spotlight. It's good night for now, and see you next time.